In November 1983, Soviet nuclear-capable aircraft, specifically Su-15 interceptors, were suddenly placed on high alert across East Germany and Poland. Ground crews began loading live nuclear weapons. The Soviet military came closer to a launch posture than at any point since 1962. Flash messages were pouring into Moscow from KGB agents in the West. They reported that NATO forces were moving to alternate wartime headquarters and maintaining strict radio silence. But across the Iron Curtain, Western commanders were completely oblivious. NATO commanders believed they were simply running a routine military simulation exercise. They had no idea their training exercise had triggered a genuine panic-driven mobilization. The exercise was called Able Archer 83. It was a 10-day drill designed to practice the procedures for responding to a hypothetical Soviet invasion of Western Europe, specifically the shift from conventional warfare to the release of nuclear weapons. To make the training effective, NATO used actual wartime communications protocols rather than standard training codes. By making the simulation perfectly realistic, they accidentally stripped away every signal that would tell the Soviets it was only a test. To understand the panic in Moscow, we have to look at the preceding 8 months. In March 1983, President Ronald Reagan gave a speech labeling the Soviet Union an evil empire. The Kremlin interpreted this straightforward rhetoric as an explicit existential threat. 2 weeks later, Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, a proposed space-based missile shield. The Soviets feared this would allow the United States to launch a nuclear attack without fear of retaliation. For decades, peace had relied on mutually assured destruction. If one side fired, both would die. A missile shield broke that stalemate, creating a terrifying first strike advantage that deeply unsettled Soviet leadership. Then, in September, the Soviet military shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007 after misidentifying it as an American spy plane, killing all 269 civilians on board. The international backlash isolated and humiliated Moscow. The superpower relationship reached its lowest point in decades. When autumn arrived, Soviet leaders were operating under the firm assumption that the United States was actively preparing a preemptive strike. The KGB established a standing intelligence directive known as Ryan. Operating out of the KGB headquarters in Moscow, analysts were tasked with finding definitive proof that an American attack was imminent. They built a massive surveillance network looking for specific, strange indicators. Spies were ordered to watch for late-night lights at government buildings, large blood purchases at Western hospitals, and sudden drops in radio traffic. This chart illustrates the logic of Operation Ryan. Various isolated data points, lights, blood, radio signals, were funneled directly into a single conclusion: nuclear first strike. The system was designed to find exactly what it was looking for. Any routine administrative change or minor military drill would now be interpreted by Soviet intelligence as mathematical proof of an incoming attack. In early November, NATO initiated Able Archer 83. Commanders shifted to alternate bunkers and began strictly simulating the complex procedural steps required to release nuclear weapons. KGB residencies across Western Europe intercepted these movements. They relayed urgent messages to Moscow that U.S. forces appeared to be at a higher state of combat readiness than any previous exercise. This checklist shows how Ryan analysts processed the event. They watched NATO impose radio silence, fly aircraft to forward bases, and execute command transitions. One by one, the exact indicators of an impending attack were checked off. The simulation then moved into its darkest phase. NATO operators began running through the final procedural steps for the actual release of nuclear weapons. The KGB's worst-case scenario was playing out in real time. The Soviet military reacted. Flash warnings went out to intelligence outposts. Across Eastern Europe, bombers were brought out onto the tarmac, and crews began strapping live nuclear payloads into the bays. NATO had crafted an exercise that perfectly mirrored a genuine strike. In response, the Soviet Union armed its weapons and stood at the edge of the launch sequence. Then, on November 11th, the schedule ran out. Able Archer 83 simply ended. NATO commanders packed up their paperwork, personnel went home, and the terrifying radio silence vanished. Soviet intelligence watched the abrupt de-escalation in total confusion. With the warning signs suddenly gone, Moscow ordered its own forces to power down and return the warheads to storage. Nobody at NATO headquarters knew what had just happened. The world survived one of its most dangerous nuclear crises, not because of a diplomatic breakthrough, but simply because a training calendar hit Friday. The true scale of the near miss only emerged through Oleg Gordievsky, a high-ranking KGB officer secretly working for British intelligence. He provided the crucial reports, proving that the Soviet fear had been entirely genuine, not political posturing. When the intelligence finally reached Ronald Reagan, he was reportedly shaken. He realized that the Soviet leadership genuinely feared a first strike and had interpreted his public rhetoric as a literal threat of war. The administration's approach began to pivot. Confrontations slowly gave way to negotiation, setting the stage for the 1985 Geneva summit with Mikhail Gorbachev. The realization of how close they had blundered into annihilation ultimately forced both sides to back away from the edge.